So, thank you for joining us for this.
I have to be
Turn off the cell phones. Okay, if you put your cell phones on vibrate, it would be appreciated. We're here to get a little bit into the Pesach spirit, and it's a busy time. So I do thank those who did come out. It's nice to hear a little bit about the season. We gave it a title of the 6 intriguing facts about Pesach. We'll hopefully get to 6. But it's a few areas where we try to remind people of a few of the practical halachos, a few discussions that relate to the history of why we do things. There are things we do because it's our core, it's our essence. There is a concept that some mitzvos are called pikudim, pikudei Hashem. And it relates to the word lehafkid, something that's deposited. And the idea behind it is that when you have, let's say, a box and something is placed within the box, it's mufkad within the box. We have to look at many mitzvos as those things that are like boxes, which are the practices, what you do, what you don't do. But understand that there's something inside. There is something inside, a deeper meaning, a deeper message, and that's how we are supposed to approach many of these mitzvahs, and that's what this season is about. We're going to be talking about chametz, and talking about matzah, and talking about kidneys, and talking about gebroks, and talking about machine matzah, we're talking about hand matzah, and shmura and non-shmura. But remember, there's something more to it. It's a zman cheruseinu. What's the concept of freedom? What's the Jewish way of viewing this concept of freedom? And our attitude towards this holiday is important as well. Right? It's not easy to make a Pesach, but it's not Judaism if all we do is complain about a Pesach. So we have to balance it with those realities. Not easy, but that's what it's about. Let's try to go ahead and appreciate this gift called Chag HaPesach. And we're going to discuss, obviously, a few of the well-known issues with a few new insights. Number one, today I picked up my daughter Avigail from school, and she was actually in a mood of talking with me a little bit, and I asked her, well, we talked what you learned in school, and she mentioned the fact that they're learning a little bit about Pesach already, and then she says to me, we eat shmura matzah, right? I say, of course, shmura matzah for the Seder, actually eat it during Pesach, I eat shmura. Aha, my teacher said, and that's always when the trouble starts. My teacher said that shmura matzah is round. And I have no recollection of any round matzahs at the table. And this is, I'm thinking to myself, here we go again. The child comes home, sees something, and it's delicate for the parent because you don't want to say, which I unfortunately at times do say, that your teacher happens to not know everything. And there is such a thing as matzah shmura, that is machine. There is such a concept, right? And then I have to start defending myself, right? That is our old minhag, that it was already done in Eretz Yisrael by the great Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael. So what was I doing from Thornhill all the way to Charlton, defending my practice? That's what I was doing. Fine. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of my practice. Why is it that if I would walk around this room and I would ask you, tell me about your Seder night, how do your matzahs look? And I think the majority of the people here would say they use their round shmura. So how did I turn into a minority? Right? How did that happen? Why do I use square machine shmura matzah? Now let me make this clear, that shmura matzah for the Seder night is required. What defines shmura? So we are told that, halachically speaking, most authorities are of the opinion that when it is needed, when you have that blend of the flour and the water, it is done with an awareness that it doesn't turn into chametz. And in addition, the kneading, the lisha, is done with the intention that we are guarding it for the sake of a mitzvah. Something is happening in the mind of the person kneading it. Okay? That is matzos, which we call shmura. Now, there's a higher standard of shmura, and that is called shmura mishat ktsira, that from the time of harvest, it already then, the processing that was done, there was someone there observing it to be sure that everything is done, that it doesn't start raining on it, that they don't put it in a bin that is full of water. Whatever guarding is required, that which was done with intention for the sake of producing a product that you could use for the Seder night. That is called shmura, but from mishat ktsira, from the time of harvest. That is considered a higher standard, and I think it's a recommended that we should all be seeking out shmura mishat ktsira. However, every single matzah out there in the marketplace that has a hashgacha is some level of shmura. So therefore, for the many good Jews out there that are picking up their box of manisheves and they buy regular matzah, they are fulfilling the mitzvah. Again, there's something to be aware of. Obviously, we try shmura mishas ktsira. But now comes the question, round or square? And obviously, if we would be visiting communities 200 years ago, everyone was using the round hand matzah. All that changes in the middle of the 19th century with introduction, with the fact that they are able to produce them by machine. I mentioned here in the past that in the early days of machine matzah, they actually had a cookie cutter, a large one, to make them round. Due to the fact that people were so accustomed to having round matzahs, you were not able to introduce into the marketplace a square matzah. But the major problem was that if you use a cookie cutter, you have the leftover corners, and the leftover corners were put back into another run, and the result was you had chametz. So therefore, when the rabbis in 1857 declared, the ones that allowed, the ones who declared that it is permissible to use a machine-produced matzah on Pesach, they made it very, very clear that it must be square, not to have the issue of the she'eriyot, of the corners. And as the Ksav Sofer put it, that you should know that in the merit of using matzah that's merubah, and the merit of using the square one, we're going to have a kibbutz galuyos, a return of the exiles, me'arba kanfot haaretz, from the four corners of the earth. So he was able to give a twist to support the idea of having something square. So this is a little bit of the history. Now obviously, the big issue with the machine matzah is not the concern for chametz, that you can take care of, but the real concern was, can there be a shmura, can there be a kneading, can there be a baking that was done lishma with intention when it is done by a machine? How is that possible? Or perhaps machines don't operate on their own. There is someone there, from pushing a button to moving rollers at time even, and perhaps the intention of the individual involved in the process is good enough. So that was a very, very big debate. For me personally, I want to figure out, why am I using machine shmura? It's a fair question, and it's a question I ask because I do it because I'm a traditional Jew and my father did it. And I, Baruch Hashem, have the privilege of remembering a Seder by my grandfather, my father's father, and he also was using a machine shmura for the Seder night. Where did that come from? This was something that was of interest for me, okay? And I think I have the answer for it. And to understand the answer, in the world I come from, I call it the yeshiva world. It's a world, it's a way of thinking. Many people in the yeshiva world are members of that world, not recognizing so much the core beliefs or the core ways of thinking. I, on the other hand, have analyzed this magnificent world I come from, approached it a little bit as a sociologist as well, and have developed the appreciation of what it's about. And I mention that because when I have the privilege of going back to the yeshiva, I could look at myself from the outside and realize, boy, this is an incredible experience to go back to this spiritual hub. In the yeshiva world, legends play a significant role. Okay, this is something we're going to mention tonight, that there are individuals that are legends. And when they allowed something or did something, that becomes like a canonized practice. Why? Why? If so-and-so did it, if the great Chafetz Chaim did it, if the great Rabbi Yisrael Salant did it, right? If the Chazon Ish did it, it is something that's acceptable. We have a term, Maaseh Rav. If a great rabbi did it, this is something that we allow. And I'm going to present to you a Maaseh Rav about a specific individual, and I think that that will explain why I do things many years later. So let me give you a little bit of the picture what I'm referring to. If we would make our way to a European yeshiva in the 1890s, we would see a lot of Torah study, in-depth Torah study. However, we would also see some good fights. Why? There was this new movement within the Yeshiva Lithuanian community known as the Musar movement, which was controversial. While up until that point, greatness was symbolized by knowledge of Torah and commitment to understanding in-depth all areas of Torah, you have what's known as the Baalei Musar, people that focus on spiritual and personal growth, analyzing the self, studying really in essence psychology to understand what tempts you, to know your weaknesses and try to work on them, to talk on yourself. And some of them were spending hours studying the text that relates to self-improvement instead of the in-depth text that is explaining the traditional commentators. This created a big to-do. The Musar movement in general became accepted due to the fact that the great Rabbi Israel Salanter was recognized as a great Torah scholar, and he had basically three great disciples that they became the legends of the Musar movement. And even a century after the birth of the Musar movement, if you would have the privilege of interacting with someone who interacted with the disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant, you were part of the legend. And let me give you a little bit of an idea of what we are talking about. We've talked here in the past about a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Esh. He was recognized as one of the greatest Talmudic scholars in Europe before the war. He, as a young man, had the guts to go ahead and debate the greatest elders in the European world. We've heard of the great Rogatchover, who was recognized as the greatest genius in Europe. And in the 1930s, younger Rabbi Weinberg argued with him on a specific issue. He was extremely well respected, and what's fascinating about his life, and a worthwhile read, a really worthwhile read about the Sridei Esh, is a book by Mark Shapiro. It's called Between the Orthodox and the Modern World, I think it's called, but it's about the Sridei Esh. And it's an incredible work because you talk about a person that was the most traditional yeshiva student, but he landed up during World War I in Berlin, and he became more interested in the intellectual approach as well. And he was one who had full command of all of the knowledge the traditional yeshiva Gadol B'Yisrael knows, and at the same time was extremely familiar with the modern and more scientific way of studying Torah. And he brought the two together. But one of the most fascinating individuals. Unfortunately, after the war, he never really recovered. He remained in Switzerland until 1966, passed away, was brought to Eretz Yisrael, and a lot of fascinating stories about Rabbi Weinberg. And he himself had the privilege of interacting with the great rabbis of the previous generation. So he shares with us a story, Rabbi Weinberg, about the fact that when he was a teenager, he would sit and learn with the old great disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant by the name of, and this is the name that is crucial for us tonight, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam. Okay? Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, recognized as one of the great disciples of Rabbi Yisrael Salant. They named three, he is one of them. And Rabbi Weinberg, as a teenager, was given the privilege of studying with Rabbi Naftali. And Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam is a legend. He's a legend because he is known as a master of Musar, a master of personal growth, a master of humility. Now, Rabbi Weinberg actually shares with us a story to give you an appreciation of what Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam was and what a legend he was while he was alive. That one time, as a teenager, Rabbi Weinberg, so this is taking place in the first few years of the 20th century, he was intensely involved in his limud Torah and his study, and he got so involved in his study that sometimes he would lose track of time. He would lose track of time, and as a result, he shares this with us, he would forget to daven mincha. Mincha's in the afternoon, he was intensely involved, he would suddenly realize that it's dark. So he struggled with it because he studied with intensity, but you shouldn't be missing mincha. So while he had a chavruta learning session as a teenager with the great elder of Naftali Amsterdam, he shared with him this issue, and he said, Rabbi, I'd like to share with you, I'm struggling with an issue that due to the fact that I get so involved and with such intensity, I study the words of Torah, I forget to daven mincha. Now Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam opens his eyes. He says, you mean you forget to daven with a minyan, right? Meaning there's no way a human could forget mincha. You mean you forget to daven with a congregation. So the young boy said, yes, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. That's exactly what I mean. I forget to daven with a minyan. He said, fine, you have to work on it. Issue settled. Now the young boy realizes that he just, due to the fact that he was scared, he lied to the well-respected, to the legend, to Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, to a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant. And he was extremely unsettled, didn't know what to do. So he went to speak to another rabbi about his new problem. Right? It's like a person who goes to a therapist, and the therapist is nasty, and they go to another therapist, exactly the same thing, because they're having issues with the therapist. Same idea. So he goes to Rabbi Nosenota Finkel, known as the Altar of Slabotka, another legend of that era, but one that people were very honest with. And he was very open, another fascinating individual, which we've had the privilege to discuss. And he shared with him his new issue. He lied to Rabbi Naftali. So the altar says to him, you are going to have to walk over to Rabbi Naftali, and now you're going to have to tell him the truth. He said, there's no way. I can't. He simply, as a teenager, felt it will destroy him to go ahead and approach this legend and say, I lied. I can't do it. The altar says, you're going to do it, and don't bother ever seeing me again until you make your way to Reb Naftali. So Rav Weinberg shares years later that it was the most difficult walk for him. He had to go from Slabotka, make his way across the bridge into Kovna, to the Shtibel where Reb Naftali was, and it was the most painful walk he ever experienced. And as he is ready to make his way into the Shtibel, a young boy runs up to him and says, the altar wants you back in Slabotka, he needs to talk to you. He says, what do you mean? I just made it all the way to Kovna, right? It wasn't a long walk, it was a suburb. I'm going to go. He said, no, the altar wants to see you right now before you talk to Reb Naftali. He turns around, goes to the altar, and the altar says, I didn't want to embarrass you. I just wanted you to experience how destructive, the damaging impact a lie is. I wanted you to have the painful journey towards Kovna without having to actually communicate with Reb Naftali. Mission accomplished, go back to your learning. This is what he shares. A lot of psychology there, and you see the idea that this is not just the focus on studying Torah, it's developing a person, right? Recognizing the value of honesty. Fascinating story this is, but you get the picture of Reb Naftali Amsterdam and his impact. Now, Reb Naftali Amsterdam, for the record, if you ask, what was he? Was he officially a Rosh Hashiva? Was he a big rabbi? Was he a mashgiach? So when you would ask him what you do, he would say, I'm a baker. He actually worked in a bakery, Reb Naftali Amsterdam. Because for him, greatness is developing yourself internally. When you have others in the yeshiva giving you the honor, giving you the kavod, you perhaps are not working enough on yourself. He was far more satisfied to work as a baker and work on his self-development. That was Reb Naftali Amsterdam. He lived in Kovna until eventually at some point he made his way to Eretz Yisrael around, I think, 1908. And here comes an interesting historical fact. And you have to remember that it is a culture of legends. And my grandfather, Rabbi Milevsky, who learned in Slabotka, right, a good decade and a half, a good 15, 20 years after these events, but he learned in Slabotka, there is no question in my mind that among the legends that existed in their Beit Midrash was Reb Naftali Amsterdam. Now, Reb Naftali Amsterdam, 1908, he puts his name to what's known in Israel as a pashkevil. You know what a pashkevil is? Go to Mashar, and you will realize that the large stones there don't need cement to keep them together because they have these glued-on announcements. And luckily they take them down every once in a while because on a daily basis, sometimes it's an announcement for a levaya, sometimes it's a cherem on a book, on a person, sometimes they're advertising that they have these new tznius garments that you could purchase. Whatever it is that you want to publicize to the community, this, I'm not going to use the word primitive, but very old form of communication was used, the pashkevil. I'm going to have more knowledge in Yiddish to give you a little bit more about the word itself, but the concept of pashkevil is well known. However, in the Hebrew University, they have a collection of all pashkevil, I know all, but a very significant collection because there's history there. There's history. And they have pashkevilim that are over 100 years old on file. Why do they have them on file? You want to know the history of what's happening in Mea Shearim in 1910, you got to know what was on the wall, because if you know what's on the wall, you know what people were talking about, what was considered significant. That's what they need to know. So there is a pashkevil, which I did not see the original, but I saw a copy online, because today you can get everything online, where Reb Naftali Amsterdam, the humble, the Baal Musar, the person who is interested in only developing himself, something he signed and he declared. He felt it is important that everyone know about this. 1908, okay, 1908. Reb Naftali Amsterdam says the following, that you should know that the machine matzah is produced by Yosef Minsker. I didn't know who Yosef Minsker is, but I looked a little bit more, and I found out that Yosef Minsker's name was actually Yosef from Minsker, last name Halprin. And if you have ever seen matzos with the name Halprin, or if you do see in Israel, it's called today Halprin Cohen, if I'm not mistaken, it goes back to this family. I still remember as a kid the Halprin matzos. So on this pashkevil it says that the matzos of Yosef Minsker, machine matzos, are 100% acceptable, and I myself, I use them for the Seder. Reb Naftali Amsterdam comes to the land of Israel and assesses the situation of the baking of matzos in the beginning of the 20th century. And most probably noted that kashrus-wise, meaning the awareness that you get all dough off your fingers, the awareness that you don't let dough sit and then go ahead and mix it back into the mixture of flour and water, was not good enough with the hand matzahs, but was good with the machine matzahs. In 1908, he basically declares that kashrus-wise, the machine matzos are better. And that's why he declares, and therefore he felt it's important to get the word out. And I have no doubt that in the Hasidic circles in Israel at that time, his words did not have such an impact. But in the world that came from Lithuania, from the yeshiva world, you have Reb Naftali Amsterdam, the legend, saying it. Machine matzahs became the ones that you would find on the table for the Seder night. Shmura machine became acceptable and recommended. And therefore there were great rabbis, among them Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach at some periods, that he was using machine shmura. You'll find it in Israel more than here, and I would go ahead and argue that that pashkevil from 1908 is the one that had an impact on it. And therefore, for me personally, it clarifies that when my grandfather made his way to Israel in 1924 with 6 other students to open a yeshiva in Hebron, the legend of Rabbi Naftali, and that basically Pesach is what guided him, and therefore on his table from that point on, it was Machine Shmura, and on my father's table, and on my table, and Be'ezras Hashem, I hope on my kids' table as well, that there will be the Machine Shmura. So at least I got and I gained some clarity, and I am fulfilling a masoret, a tradition, by doing it. You do what your masoret is, at least I feel comfortable with my masoret, and somehow I no longer have to feel guilty that my daughter's teacher feels otherwise. So that's piece of information number 1. Okay? Number 2.
Maybe he also used the machine matzah.
For the Seder?
Yeah.
Why? For the Shmur? Okay.
Maybe also, I mean,
I think he would have communicated that to fulfill the Shmura, Lishma, the Pashkevil itself seems to indicate Rabbi Naftali felt it's okay. So that's what he indicates.
Can you change your Masorah?
Yeah.
So when a question is asked, the general answer we always get is you stick to Masorah. But obviously it's not true, because I know that my great-grandfather was most probably using a hand. So someone changed the Masorah. So the question is, when do you change a Masorah? Obviously that is something that has to be assessed. Rabbi Naftali felt that there's a good reason here, because in 1908 he felt the quality was better. Correct? Today, I don't know enough. I have not visited enough hand bakeries to go ahead and make such a statement. But I do know that the machine shmura I get from Eretz Yisrael, from a specific bakery, where I'm confident with it. Bottom line is, yes, there are situations where a masoret is changed, but there's caution. We have to be cautious, but we have to have seichel as well, which is the challenge of Judaism. Now, number 2, about legends. We're going to talk a little bit again about legends. Now, there's something very interesting. We talk about the Shoah, the Holocaust. We talk about it here in Toronto a lot because it's our Judaism today. There's no question. You know, Milevsky said the 614th commandment, right? There is such a concept that you cannot approach Judaism today or the Jewish world today without thinking of the Holocaust. Fact. You cannot walk into a cemetery here in Toronto. I guarantee that if you look at 3 matzeves, you are going to have some information about the Shoah. Fact. It's what we are today. You know, the reality is I will be writing a Komas Matzeva this week, Sunday, by Rebbetzin Frankel. And on the back, there's a name. The name of her sister and her husband and the child, which happens to be the only Irish citizen that was killed by the Nazis, right? The Shoah is everywhere. Now, what would be perhaps a little bit surprising to some of you here, probably not. In the United States, it's not the same. It is not the same. And the reason is, here in Canada, when you look at the Jewish community, from my understanding, 1 in 3 Jews you're going to approach is either a survivor or a descendant, a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild of a survivor. That's how it is in Canada. You go to the United States, the numbers are very, very different. Depends on your community. In some communities a little bit more, but in some communities, like in Memphis, it was much less. So Shoah is not the same. And even in the yeshivot, when they talk about Shoah, and I can prove this to you from videos, a lot is about, when they talk about the Holocaust, they talk about the loss of the Torah. It's true, by the way. There was a tremendous loss of great rabbinic authorities. Can't deny that. But obviously, there's much more than that. Their focus is the loss of the great Torah scholars and the Torah scholarship and the thousands upon tens of thousands of yeshiva students and girls in seminary and Beis Yaakov and school. They talk about the loss of Torah. Why is it? Because for many of them, they don't have that relative that they can look out. They don't have like my bubby, right, where I was able to look at her and I was able to know that, yeah, my bubby lost her whole family in the Shoah, right? I could go ahead and say that I'm not actually a descendant of survivors. I'm not. I am a descendant of those who did not survive. Right? Like my great-grandmother in Poland, that was burned to death. We know that for a fact. Or my great-grandfather in his little shtetl that was shot to death. In other words, I'm a descendant of someone that did not survive. But in the yeshiva world, a lot has to do with the loss of Torah. When we talk about that loss of Torah, there is one person that is mentioned number one on this list in the yeshiva world as a legend of great Torah scholarship. And his name was Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. And when you look at the Torah world of the decades leading to the Shoah, in the Lithuanian yeshivot, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman is mentioned. Number one, he was a disciple of the Chafetz Chaim, even though he was independent, because he was a great man on his own. And his depth of knowledge of Torah was incredible. And his lectures, his shiurim, were known as the greatest of all. He was one of the superstars of that era. My grandfather loved sharing with great pride that when they got engaged, when my grandparents got engaged in 1940 in Lita, in Lithuania, they got engaged in Lithuania, in Tels, got married in Shanghai, right? An interesting trip they took as an engaged couple. 11 days trip, right? Sounds exciting. Trans-Siberia. But they signed some kind of document. I'm not sure if it was an actual t'naim, but one of the individuals that signed was Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who happened to visit Tels during that period of time. And they took my grandfather took great pride in it, that he was able to interact with Rabbi Chanan a year before he passed away. He passed away before he was taken out of Kovna into, was it the 11th or the 9th fort? Those of you who visited will probably know more if it's the 11th or the 9th fort, and was basically tortured and shot to death by the Nazis, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. Now, Rabbi Chanan's impact on the Jewish world of today is quite great, because when it came to Lithuanian rabbis, it was a diverse crowd. You had those who were leaning to the right, and there were those that were a little bit more liberal in some areas. And this related to all kinds of questions towards the study of secular science, right? Secular topics, right? What is the form? How should preschool or how should elementary school look like, right? So obviously it depends where you come from. Or more than anything else, the attitude towards Zionism. Secular Zionism. Is it treif, right? Is the Mizrahi treif? Or do you say, no, after all, you know, even though we are Aguda, but within Agudas Yisrael, you have those that felt that there are many areas that we have to work with the Mizrahi. It was a diverse crowd within the Lithuanian world, okay? When you look at that group on the right, I'm not going to use the word extreme, but on the right, you had two great rabbis who really stood for the hard line. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman and Rabbi Aaron Kotler. Those were the two. So therefore, when there was an Aguda conference in 1937, the ones who came out forcefully against secular Zionism and having anything to do with them or supporting this concept of the Yeshuv, you had those two great luminaries. And it's quite fascinating that the Almighty worked it out, that one of them survived and really established the direction of Torah in North America with the Yeshiva in Lakewood, Rabbi Aaron Kotler. Okay, but the two names go hand in hand. When it comes to the more open approach, it was the Tels movement, like Rebbe Meir Bloch, who, on the other hand, believed that there are things that we should work with Mizrahi. We may not agree in everything, but when it comes to the value of Eretz Yisrael, when it comes to appreciating the fact that we could go ahead and establish ourselves in Eretz Yisrael, or as a person who lived into the 1950s, the gift of Eretz Yisrael and Medinas Yisrael, different approaches did exist. So obviously when you talk about this legend, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, you're looking at someone from the right. Among the areas where you would identify a difference, when you go ahead and discover something that is new, in other words, an area in halacha that I did not receive from my traditional Rebbe, or from his Rebbe, but something that I found in a manuscript from 900 years ago, how much do I take it into consideration? That's a little bit more academic, you realize. Because the traditional approach is that I work with what was handed to me, And if my Rebbe didn't tell it to me, and if it was not known to my master and from the institution I came from, it is not something I take into consideration. On the other hand, if you take the more broader academic approach, which today is discussed broad, is relevant in many areas, Tcheles, for example. If I take the approach that, yes, if I find now a manuscript that was not known for many centuries, perhaps I should take it into consideration. Okay, these are among the questions. So what I'm going to present to you is an interesting fact. And it relates to, number one, Reb Elchanan Wasserman, and a finding from something that was published in 1864 by a chevra that was known, a group that was known as Makitzei Nir Damim. In other words, finding things that were asleep, that were schluffing for many centuries. And they found the work of from the Gaonic period. And in that work, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman finds something that he feels is very, very interesting and relevant. And it works as follows. I hope we're following all together. So what you need to remember is Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, and you have to realize that taking and finding from the old to adjust the new is a little bit of a chidush. There's a little bit of insight there. And it works as follows. When I was 20 years old, we had, I think it was a Seder, we were for a Pesach meal in Thornhill. My parents moved back, and we were by the Taubes, by Rabbi Taub, on Bevshire. And Reb Baruch Taub, we all know Reb Baruch Taub. Reb Baruch Taub always had interesting people at the Seder and interesting items at the Seder. So that year, he had a measuring cup at the Seder, at the Pesach table. It was a glass measuring cup. Now, most measuring cups have on one side milliliters, on one side ounces, on one side cups. The measuring cup, the glass measuring cup that was on the Taub's table at the time, on one side it said Reb Chaim Naeh, on the other side it said Reb Moshe Feinstein, on the other side there was a line that said Chazon Ish. What was that all about? You want to go ahead and drink wine at the Seder for the 4 cups? How much is your cup supposed to have? Well, it depends what rabbi you ask. Well, what are the measurements? Well, according to Reb Chaim Naeh, it's 3 ounces. According to Moshe Feinstein, it is 4.2. According to the Chazon Ish, it is 5 ounces. You want to be sure you got it right. So you had one glass with all the answers. So at every Seder, you could go ahead and work out. So that was very, very fascinating to me. And obviously, I wanted to know a little bit more about why are there different opinions, right? Because really, it should be quite simple. How much are you supposed to drink at the Seder? You're supposed to drink 4 cups. By the way, you don't have to drink a complete cup. If it's hard for you, you have to drink rov kos, the majority of a cup. How much is every cup supposed to have? A revi'it, a quarter. A quarter of what? A quarter of a lug. Okay? How much is a lug? So the Talmud tells us the lug is a volume of 6 eggs. So it comes out you have to drink the quarter of a volume of 6 eggs, which, let's do the math, get your computers out, 1.5. So you have to have a cup that has the volume of 1.5 eggs. Seems simple, right? So how do you figure it out? So go to the supermarket and purchase an egg, okay? That's not the question of Pesach. Purchase a medium egg. You're not going to find a medium egg because all the eggs are there are extra large or large, right? The medium ones are used in manufacturing. So let's be machmir, okay? We're going to buy a large egg. Buy a large egg and do some displacement, okay? So get a bowl, drop it in, see how much is displaced. You're going to get around 1.8, 1.9 ounces. Okay, 1.9 ounces. So you need to do 1.5 of that egg. So you get to something like 2.8 ounces. I'm going to be machmer. 3 ounces should be enough. No question about that, by the way. This is an halachic statement right now. Your cup should have 3 ounces. If it is 2.7, it's also good. But perhaps be machmer up to 3 ounces. As I mentioned here in the past, that I've identified a store, I think it's called Crate and Barrel, or Barrel and Crate.
Crate and Barrel.
Crate and Barrel. It's in the Yorkdale. I've been there, and they had, at least when I visited a few years ago, 3-ounce glass cups, right? And they're quite cheap. They were like $4 or $5. I was thinking of buying many, writing on it something like Kiddush, and then selling it for $95 because it has a Jewish wording, right? It should be much more selling. So those are 3 ounces. Those you could use for the Seder. I love using them for the Seder. Some of my kids are not happy because, especially when they were younger teenagers, they wanted more wine. That's a different discussion. So that's what halachically is good enough. So what changed? Why are there different opinions on the Rabbi Taub glass? The answer is, a few centuries ago, there was a rabbi who analyzed the Talmudic text that relates to measurement. And the Talmud tells us that the volume of an egg relates to the volume of 2 fingers by 2 fingers plus a little bit more. He did a comparison between the volume of the egg and the measurements of his fingers, and it didn't match. The egg did not reach the same measurement. So therefore he suggested that perhaps, and he said it as a perhaps the eggs of today are smaller than the ones in the past. And if you take that perhaps, and you take the approach that perhaps they're half size, boom, that's how you get yourself 5 ounces of wine. Now if you enjoy wine, why not, right? And if you enjoy matzah, by the way, because that volume relates also to a kezait. The volume of an olive relates, in the great rabbis tell us that it relates to the volume of an egg. According to some, there are 3 olive size in volume in an egg. So you have to eat more matzah. Everything changes because of that. My grandfather actually would sit at the Seder, and when he would eat his matzah, and he was knowledgeable of the fact that the great Chazon Ish required more, so he would sit there and say in Yiddish that the Chazon Ish must have been a very hungry man. That was the line he would use, because you have to use a larger amount. So everything changes because of this concern that perhaps even the olives today are smaller. So this was something that was discussed and debated, and it made its way into every downstairs you're going to find. A lot of these pamphlets for Pesach, from the OU, from the COR, from the MK, and some of them are going to have these shiurim. Many of these measurements, and I would say even all of these measurements, are in some way taking into consideration this concern of perhaps the size change. Fine? Now comes something that is very interesting. I'm holding here a book. It's called Kovetz Shiurim. If you go through the yeshiva system, this is indeed text that is canonized because it's from Rabbi Chanan Wasserman. And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, you know, he was a tzaddik, a Torah scholar. He had everything to offer, and therefore this text is a significant text. And in one area, one of the sections of something he himself did not write to publish, but was gathered after his passing from his own handwriting, he writes the following, that I found in Shuvat HaGeonim that was printed in 1864. Meaning, he took text that was not part of the traditional yeshiva text, studied it, and found something interesting. That the Gaonim from 900 years ago note that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he told us how much to eat, right? We asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what do we do Seder night? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, eat matzah. We say, okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how much matzah should we eat? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, the volume of an olive. Now, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say the volume of an olive? Why not give us one of the measurements they used at that time? So this Tshuvas HaGaonim tells us the reason is as follows. The measurements they used 3,500 years ago, perhaps are not going to be used in some point in the future. The one thing that remains the same, says the Tshuvas HaGaonim, is the size of nature's produce. And therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, eat the volume of an olive, because the olives today are going to be the same olives 3,000-4,000 years from now. And yes?
When you buy olives, they come in different sizes?
So obviously it's the average. Obviously it's talking about an average. But this concern that perhaps our olives today are half of the past because of some issue with measurement, because of a technicality, this is thrown out of the window by this Tshuvas HaGaonim. So now this would not surprise me if this would be stated by someone that was more academic, by someone that was, we would call a little bit more modern. But Rabbi Chanan Wasserman ends off after he quotes it and he says, Mevu'ar, it is quite clear, Shelo kedat achronim, that it is not like the later authorities that today things are smaller, meshayu b'zman chachmei Talmud. He says basically, it is quite clear, nothing has changed. Don't go ahead and start, no requirement for the larger amounts. So this is something that was quite interesting, quite interesting to me as a chidush, something I was not aware of. Okay? Now, next. Among the, when we talk about Pesach, we talk about communities. Sfaradim, Ashkenazim, right? Kidniot, right? Among us, the Ashkenazim, the big question relates to Gebroxt, Matzah Shruya, right? You've heard the discussions of Gebroxt. Yes, Gebroxt, not Gebroxt. You have these hotels, right? That advertise. You have 24-hour tea room. You can eat for 24 hours. You have entertainment, but you have the highest standard of kashrus, right? And it will be non-Gebroxt. So therefore, everything, all the pancakes will be made from potato starch and eggs. In other words, the Gebroxt is a big to-do. I'll never forget that when I was a teenager, or maybe early 20s, we actually landed up in a Pesach hotel. I worked there as a mashgiach. It's something that I did not appreciate, and I was very unhappy. It was done against my will. I did forgive those who played a role in getting me there. But there were some issues there in the kitchen. Some serious issues there in the kitchen. And again, I do believe that there are good hashgachas today that would happen then would not happen today. But nevertheless, as I'm walking around thinking, boy, I hope this place is kosher, some yid comes over to me and says, well, you're a mashgiach, can you tell me what's gebrox and what's not? And I had a desire to say to him, that's the last thing you should worry about. All the concerns, don't worry about gebrox. Believe me, worry about some other more serious issues. Now, the gebrox, what is basically gebrox? A concern that perhaps on your baked matzah, there's still some flour. And if you add water to it, it becomes chametz. Now, do we take that into consideration or not? So you do know that in Hasidic communities, they indeed consider it very, very serious. Now, those who take it, who really kick it up a notch in awareness are the Chabad community, where they would not even bring matzah to the table. Right? They would eat it out of bags, from my understanding. There's this tremendous concern. And their concern dates back to 7 Rebbes ago, to the first Chabad Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya. And the Baal HaTanya shares with us the following, that you should know that the requirements to avoid water coming in contact with your matzah is needed, is not needed, but I mean is required today. Because in the past 20 years, there's been a shift in the production of matzah, where 20 years ago or so, they would take their time with the kneading, and the water would come in contact with all the flour. Today, they are baking things faster, so there's a concern that there's a pocket of flour, and the pocket of flour, if you throw it into water, will become chametz. In other words, it's trying to point out that something changed over the past 20 years. And it's a little bit of a mystery. Why is he noting that there was no issue and no requirement to avoid gebrox 20-something years ago, but now suddenly there is an issue? This was a little bit of a mystery until I found, and I'm not going to give the long version, but the bottom line is, I have here testimony that the Baal Shem Tov himself, and I'll read it in Hebrew, Lo nahag adayin bechumra zu. It was not the practice of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, I would like to attempt to walk through Hasidic communities and share with them this fact that gebrox was not from Baal Shem Tov. Now, it started by his disciples, the Maggid of Mezrich, and obviously the Baal HaTanya, which are great luminaries, and there's no, I'm not putting down those that have, God forbid, the practice. But it's quite fascinating that the Baal HaTanya has to explain that it's only required because something changed over the past 20 years, because he knows very well that 20-something years earlier, the great Baal Shem Tov was not concerned with it. An interesting fact, indeed, regarding this area. Yes?
But that was 250 years ago.
Okay.
So maybe 20 years later, the meaning changed.
Obviously, things change, but I mean, that's how the minhag starts. In other words, you are taking the approach of something that's rushed. You have to assess in every generation. It becomes canonized, it becomes a minhag, similar to Kidniot. In other words, it becomes a minhag, even if the reason. Yes? So this is a good, so this is taking place, this is written in the late 1790s. The machine is later. The machine really blows up in 1857. So there is a gap. I tried connecting, but it doesn't appear that there is a connection indeed. Anyway, we're running out of time. Yes?
How do we know that Baal Shem Tov didn't eat he ate the ropes?
There was in Eretz Yisrael there was Rabbi Yoshib who was a Shub, who was Shaykh Adam Boydek, and he lived in Eretz Yisrael among the Hasidim, and he recorded all the traditions he heard from the Hasidim. And one of them he heard was from Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who was a big Hasidic Rebbe, and Rabbi Menachem Mendel told him that you should know that Baal Shem Tov lo nahag. So this is something that is traced by reliable sources indeed. Anyway, there's a lot more that could be discussed, and obviously it's an opportunity that if you do have halacha l'maisa questions, I think we talked a little bit about matzah, we talked a little bit about measurements, we talked a little bit about the basic needs of a Seder and Seder night. Little taste of it. If you do have questions, I'm more than happy to answer any question indeed. An opportunity to maximize the season, to appreciate, because I see this all as exciting material. It's about Pesach, it's about Zman Cheruseinu, it's about our identity, and it's about transmitting it to the future, right? When we have excitement about it, the next generation says, yes, there's something exciting here, and hopefully they'll do their part to keep this magnificent tradition alive. Thank you so much for listening, and everyone have a Chag Kasher B'Sameach. We're going to daven, if that's okay, we're going to daven Ma'ariv now. Okay? Thank you.